We begin really the final trek, and the story of Joseph very much, and his brothers very much dominates the final 14 chapters of the book of Genesis, 37 through 50, with a couple of detours taken along the way. And the sheet that I have passed out is Joseph is a type of Christ. A few weeks ago, we passed out a sheet that called Isaac, and the similarities between Isaac and Jesus. If you look at the comparison list of Joseph and Jesus, Joseph was loved by his father, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a few minutes of just how much that Jacob loved Joseph, and Jesus was loved by his father. This is my beloved son. Joseph's brothers did not believe him and hated him. The Jews did not believe in Christ, and also Jesus' brothers initially did not believe he was who he was, which is the next line. Joseph's brothers rejected his right to rule, and the Jewish leader said, "We will not have this man to rule over us." Joseph's brothers conspired against him, and we are told in Matthew 27:1, it says they took counsel against Jesus. They stripped Joseph of his garments in Genesis 37. They stripped Jesus in Matthew chapter 27. Joseph was sold for silver, 20 pieces in Genesis 37, and Jesus was also sold for silver. And how many pieces of silver was Jesus sold for? Yeah, it's on the final exam. Before you get into heaven, you'll have to know that one. 30 pieces. Okay. I'm just kidding there. This will not be on the test. No matter how many times I say that, it just never gets old. I say that. You probably don't see that. Let's see. Everything Joseph put his hand to, he prospered. And Isaiah 53 says, "And the pleasure of the Lord prospered in his hand." All things were laid into Joseph's trust. And we're told in John chapter 3, God hath given all things into his hand. Joseph's own brothers did not recognize him. The Jews did not recognize their Messiah. Joseph was tempted and yet did not sin. That's going to be an important point we'll look at when in all of this. Jesus was tempted in all things, yet was without sin, Hebrews 4:15. Joseph was bound, and Jesus was bound. Joseph was condemned with two criminals. Jesus was crucified with two criminals. One criminal was given life, and the other was condemned. Jesus told one of the criminals, "Today you shall be with me in paradise." Joseph was trustworthy and wise. God said about Jesus, "This is my beloved Son in whom I'm well pleased." Joseph's brothers bowed their knee to him. All, at the name of Jesus, every knee will bow. Joseph was 30 years old in Genesis 41. Jesus was about 30 years old in Luke 3. God planned the suffering of Joseph in advance to save many. John 3:16, "For God so loved the world that he sent his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him shall be saved." Joseph was made ruler over all of Egypt. Jesus said, "All power has been given unto me." Joseph married a foreign bride who shared his glory. Believers in Christ are joint heirs with him in his glory. Joseph was cast into a pit and then later delivered out of it. When Jesus died, he descended into the lower parts of the earth and later ascended into heaven. Joseph was imprisoned based on false charges. During the trial of Jesus, false witnesses were brought in to testify against him. Joseph's brothers later repented for what they did, and we're told in Zechariah prophecy, "And they shall look upon me whom they have pierced, and they shall mourn." So the things that Joseph has in common with Jesus are phenomenal to say the least. I thought you might be interested in that. On the backside of that, because God had told Abraham that they were going to be in Egypt for 400 years. On the other side, it shows you that time frame of what was talked about in that in great detail. So, Genesis chapter 37. Jacob lived in the land of his father's sojournings in the land of Canaan. And these are the generations. Remember we talked about there, it's called in Hebrew the Toledoth, the generations of Jacob. And over we have seen when they have talked about the generations, they're telling about the genealogy of those people in that, the family lines. And Diane, I'll get to your question that you asked me 3 weeks ago, remember? Okay. Remind me of what you said, okay? Yes. Joseph, being 17 years old, that's important to know. Why do you think they told us that Joseph was 17 years old? It's just a little breadcrumb that they dropped for us. And if Joseph was 17 years old, how old, roughly speaking, was his oldest brother? That will be on the quiz. There's about 14 years difference between the youngest and the oldest. So if Joseph was 17, then his oldest brother would be around 31 years of age. So there's not a great difference. Is there anybody here that has a sibling that is more than 14 years older or younger than them? Pardon me? You had many that were more than 14 years in difference of you? Okay. 14 and 17, okay. Michelle, did you have one that you said? Oh, I thought you had your raised hand. Anyone else? So, we often find that there's age differences in this. So that's roughly speaking. So keep that in the back of your mind when they talk about his brothers. They're not a lot, many years older, although when you're young and you think your sibling is 14 years older, you think, well, that's a great age difference. But Joseph, being 17 years old, was pasturing the flock with his brothers. He was a boy with the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah, his father's wives. And Joseph brought a bad report of them to their father. Now Israel loved Joseph more than any other of his sons, because he was a son of his old age, and he made him a robe of many colors. And we'll stop right there. Anything jump off in that last verse to you? How many of you have favorite children? Wilma, who's your favorite child? This is being recorded and they are listening. Anybody else have favorite children or grandchildren? Absolutely. Are you going to admit which one is? Don't. Just say no. And how does this play into what is about to happen? We say, well, why is it told that Joseph was 17 years old? And why is it told this? Well, it plays into what is about to happen. And why it is about to happen? Because it says that Israel or Jacob loved Joseph more than any of his other sons, because he was a son of his old age. And that's typical. If anybody ever heard of parents who have children in their later years, that maybe that surprise child comes maybe 10 years after they've had the last one, and that younger one comes, and then they almost seem like they're getting preferential treatment. Because the older children are always going to say, what are they going to say? Yeah, you wouldn't do that for me. How come he gets or she gets all of those special privileges? It is a natural part of what happens in sibling rivalry and in parenting. And that is would we say that this is a mistake? Well, we might view it that way. But remember, we're going to get to Genesis chapter 15, and Joseph is going to make a statement that you meant it for harm, but God meant it for good. And why did God mean it for good? We'll jump all the way to the end of the story of that. Why did God mean it for good? To save the nation. And how God goes about this is really beyond our ability sometimes. And if you'd like to know that, read the book of Job sometimes and see what those people understood. Job and his three friends, and then later Eliphaz. But when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, they hated him and could not speak peacefully to him. Now Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him even more. It seems like he just can't do anything right. They hated him even more. He said to them, "Hear this dream that I have dreamed." And can't you just picture him when he says this? "Hey, you guys, I've had a dream." Behold, we were binding sheaves in a field. And behold, my sheaf arose and stood upright, and behold, your sheaves gathered around it and bowed down to my sheaf. His brother said to him, Are you indeed to reign over us, or are you indeed to rule over us? So they hated him even more for his dreams and for his words. What is a sheaf or a sheaves? Yeah, it's like a shocks of grain that have been gathered together. And if you, how many of you have lived around the Amish? This is something that isn't done typically by quote unquote modern farmers, although Amish were modern in their time at one time. But they stack them all up into these, and they dry somewhat. And then when they come around to have them, what's the term I'm looking for? Harvested. Separated. What's the term I'm looking for? What's the name of the machine? The thresher. When the thresher comes around. When the thresher comes around. And in the old days, when they were going to thresh, they would put them on a flat surface, and then they would have a typical machine in which they'd beat it and they'd thresh it. How many of you, as children, their mother threshed them to within an inch of their life? Yes, and you were glad of it, weren't you? Everybody says yes. The camera says yes. Yes, we thought it was a threshing. Okay, and what they were doing is they're separating the grain from the stalk and from the stem. In later days, when they ran it through the thresher, it would do that job, and then the chaff was thrown about. So here he's talking about these that are going to bow down to him, and they realize immediately in that dream that he's talking about them. And it is, if it wasn't enough that, number one, his dad loved him. Number two, his dad makes him the coat of many colors. Number three, he has a dream. And in this dream, he shows that they're going to bow down to him. Verse 9, Then he dreamed another dream and told it to his brothers and said, Behold, I have dreamed another dream. Behold, the sun, the moon, and the 11 stars were bowing down to me. But when he told it to his father and to his brothers, his father rebuked him and said to him, What is this dream that you have dreamed? Shall I and your mother and your brothers indeed come to bow ourselves to the ground before you? And his brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the saying in mind. He's not really setting himself up to be sibling of the year. Do you think Joseph knew how special that he was? He's 17 years old, and maybe that's one of the reasons they give it. At 17 years old, older, he might say, well, he might still say, yeah, I'm still, Mom, I'm still Dad's favorite, no matter how old he gets. He says, I'm Dad's favorite. No. If he was wise, he might have taken his dad aside and said, Hey, Dad, this isn't working out so well. Just make me a plain coat, okay? And don't always talk about how much you love me and show me all this favoritism. But he's 17 years old and doesn't realize it. But remember, this is all playing into the plan of what's going to happen. Beginning in verse 12, Now his brothers went to pasture their father's flock near Shechem. Now, if we were to look at a map and say, well, he's going to Shechem, he's going as if he's let's take our building here. This is where they had been pasturing the flock, and they're going to go a little bit further down Veterans Drive. And if you're not familiar, Veterans Drive is the next, am I pointing in the right direction? Veterans Drive is the next road over, just a couple of blocks. No, they're going many miles away in order to this. I've read that it may have been as many as 50 or 60 miles away. So he has quite a journey to go. They're near Shechem. And Israel said to Joseph, Are not your brothers pasturing the flock at Shechem? Remember, he's already made a bad report of them once before, so they know what might be happening. Are not your brothers pasturing the flock at Shechem? Come, I will send you to them. And he said to them, Here I am. So he said to them, Go now, see if it is well with your brothers and with the flock, and bring me word. So he sent him from the valley of Hebron, and he came to Shechem. And a man found him wandering in the fields, and the man asked him, What are you seeking? I am seeking my brothers, he said. Tell me, please, where they are pasturing the flock. And the man said, They have gone away, for I heard them say, Let's go to Dothan. So Joseph went after his brothers and found them at Dothan. They saw him from afar, and before he came near to them, they conspired against him to kill him. They said to one another, Here comes the dreamer. Come, now, let us kill him and throw him into one of the pits. Then we will say that a fierce animal has devoured him, and we will see what will become of his dreams. Can you imagine? Can you imagine what it would take for his 10 brothers? Remember that no doubt Benjamin is not with them. But for his 10 brothers to conspire to kill their brother, their father's favorite son. What would it take to bring them to that point in their lives? Jealousy. Jealousy. Now, how many of you are driven to that point in jealousy? It could happen. So be warned lest jealousy becomes a part of your life, because jealousy eventually turns to bitterness, and that's what's happening with these young men. But they are willing to kill their younger brother. Now we think of if we go back just a little bit further, he talks about pasturing the flock. Remember how great that Jacob's flocks were when he is going to be reunited with Esau. He calls out of his flock group after group that he sends, and it perhaps would be as they're going over up and down hills for as far as perhaps that Esau could see that all of these, and he says, now put some space in between them. So he is giving them, part of them, to Esau. Now years later, God continues to bless him, and think of how large these flocks are and how far they would have to go in order to pasture them. And so here they've come down to this, and we'll see what becomes of his dreams, thinking that they are going to thwart. And at this point, we go back and look at the two dreams that he has. And we're going to see that Joseph doesn't often have dreams or visions from God. They're few and far in between. But to realize that he has had these dreams, and his brothers don't believe that these are dreams from God. Because if they had understood the true weight of when God gives someone a dream, they know that no matter what, these are going to happen, but they think that they're going to outdo them when they say, well, we'll see what becomes of the dreams. But when Reuben heard it, remember Reuben is the firstborn, Reuben rescued him out of his hand, saying, Let us not take his life. And Reuben said to them, Shed no blood, throw him into this pit here in the wilderness, but do not lay a hand on him, that he might rescue him out of their hand to restore him to his father. So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the robe of many colors that he wore, and they took him and threw him into a pit. The pit was empty, there was no water in it. What other famous person in the Old Testament was thrown into a pit? Jeremiah, and there was just a little bit of mud in that one. But here we have a pit. I have that I've written here that he was in the pit. Then they sat down to eat, and looking up they saw a caravan of Ishmaelites. And who were the Ishmaelites? Take the ites off there, and you know that they're related to Ishmael. Isaac and Ishmael. Pardon me? The other son, yes. For Abraham had Isaac, and he also had Ishmael. Okay? So they're the Ishmaelites coming down from Gilead with their camels bearing gum, balm, myrrh on their way to carry it down to Egypt. And if we looked at a map, and you can imagine this is a map of Israel, they're coming from Gilead, and Gilead is on the northeast side of and to the east of Sea of Galilee. So they're coming down, and they're going to Egypt over to the southwest. So they're on their way down there, and that was typical. They had these trade routes of which they were well traveled. So they're going to sell them on that. Then Judah said to his brothers, What profit is it if we kill our brother and conceal his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, which they were related to them. And let not our hand be upon him, for he is our brother, our own flesh. And his brothers listened to him. Then Midianite traders passed by, and they drew Joseph up and lifted him out of the pit and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver. They took Joseph to Egypt. Diane had the question of those children that came out of Keturah from Abraham, who they were. And one of them was named Midian. So that is, there's only a couple of instances in the Old Testament where we read about that. And this is the Midianites, which were, some scholars believe that that's what they were talking about, the Midianites. You asked that question of who they became. So it's the Midianites in this. And they took Joseph to Egypt. When Reuben returned to the pit and saw that Joseph was not in the pit, he tore his clothes and returned to his brothers and said, "The boy is gone, and where shall I go?" Then they took Joseph's robe, slaughtered a goat, and dipped the robe in the blood. And they sent the robe of many colors and brought it to their father and said, "This we have found. Please identify whether it is your son's robe or not." And he identified it and said, "It is my son's robe. A fierce animal has devoured him. Joseph is without doubt torn to pieces." Then Jacob tore his garments and put sackcloth on his loins and mourned for his son many days. All his sons and his daughters rose up to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted and said, "No, I shall go down to Sheol to my son mourning." Thus his father wept for him. Meanwhile, the Midianites had sold him in Egypt to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard. How many of you have ever watched the crime show Columbo? If you haven't, he's just a hoot to watch. And I think if Columbo were the detective on this, in this case, he would figure it out rather quickly. But they take as we've read, he takes his robe, they kill a lamb or a goat, and they dip it in blood. Have you ever thought, what if Joseph comes back? You know, Columbo would always, the people that he would investigate, they had always thought they had committed the perfect crime. It's always the perfect crime here. And so they think that perhaps they have committed that perfect crime, not realizing they have an escape route. Well, we found his jacket. How are they going to explain this when Joseph comes back and says, "Hey, they tried to kill me, Pop"? You know, this isn't a well thought out plan, obviously. But remember, we're always looking at, because we know how this ends. We're going to immediately go to chapter 50 and say, "You meant it for evil, but God meant it good, so that many people might be saved." And in all of this. And the naysayers and the scoffers and the skeptics will say, why did God have to do all of this? Why did he put them through that punishment of thinking that his son was dead for up to 20 years? Why did God have to do all of that? That's when we turn to the book of Job and say, and when God says to Job, "Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth?" And for us to try to figure out how all of this is going to fit together. We know how it ends. And we think, well, this is how I would have done it. But we can't. But this is how God has done this to that point. Now, in sort of a parenthetical chapter, we come to chapter 38. One of the parts of the law when Moses is going to give it in a couple of hundred years there on Mount Sinai is that no one of a certain type of birth can go till the 10th generation into the temple. Here in chapter 38, what was the tribe that Jesus came from? Came from the tribe of Judah. And so if Jesus came from the tribe of Judah, then David came from the tribe of Judah. And we can follow all of that if you want to go to Matthew chapter 1. So we're going to read of an occasion in chapter 38 about Judah and Tamar. And it is not for the faint of heart, and it's not always for a story to be talked about in great detail amongst children. But we're all adults here. But we can see that God is going to work this out. And because of the relationship between Judah and Tamar, which is an illicit coming together, we're just going to go to Matthew chapter 1. Let's turn to the New Testament to Matthew chapter 1. When God says that up to the 10th generation, those people will not be able to allow it in the temple. Now, the book of the genealogy. Did I ever tell you? Never mind. The book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac, and Isaac the father of Jacob, and Jacob the father of Judah. All right, now let's start counting these generations from Judah down to David. Judah and his brothers, Judah the father of Perez and Zerah by Tamar. And Perez the father of Hezron, Hezron the father of Ram, and Ram the father of Amminadab, Amminadab the father of Nahshon, Nahshon the father of Salmon, Salmon the father of Boaz by Rahab, Boaz the father of Obed by Ruth, Obed the father of Jesse, and Jesse the father of David the king. So when we get to the genealogy and we see that there are 10 generations that separate Judah from David, and then we read in the law to where the 10th generation will not be allowed into the temple by an illicit relationship, we will make that connection. And make that connection we will in a while. So in chapter 38, it happened at the time that Judah went down from his brothers and turned aside to a certain Adullamite, whose name was Hira. There Judah saw the daughter of a certain Canaanite, whose name was Shua. He took her and went into her, and she conceived and bore a son, and called his name And she conceived again, and she called his name Onan. Yet again she bore a son, his name was Shelah. Judah was in Chezib when she bore him. And Judah took a wife for his firstborn, and her name was Tamar. But Judah's firstborn, was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord put him to death. Then Judah said to Onan, go into your brother's wife, and perform the duty of a brother-in-law to her, and raise up offspring for your brother. And that was part of the tradition, that if the husband of the wife died, then it was the responsibility of the brother. And that is carried on into the law. And as we get on and read it, and let's see, good drop down to verse 11. Then Judah said to Tamar, his daughter-in-law, remain a widow in your father's house till Shelah, my son, grows up, for he feared that he too would die, like his brother. So Tamar went and remained in her father's house. In the course of time, the wife of Judah, Shua's daughter, died. When Judah was comforted, he went up to Timnah to his sheep shearers, he and his friend Hira, the Adullamite. And when Tamar was told, your father-in-law is going up to Timnah to shear his sheep, she took off her widow's garments and covered herself with a veil and wrapped herself up and sat at the entrance of Enaim, which is on the road to Timnah, for she saw that Shelah was grown up and she had not been given to him in marriage. So Judah has neglected his responsibility of giving his son over, that his son's family name might be perpetuated. And so she comes up with this plan. When Judah saw her, he thought she was a prostitute, for she had covered her face. He turned to her at the roadside and said, come, let me go in to you, for he did not know that she was his daughter-in-law. She said, what will you give me that you may come into me? He answered, I will send you a young goat from the flock. And he said, if you give me a pledge until you send it. He said, what pledge shall I give you? She replied, your signet and your cord and your staff that is in your hand. So he gave them to her and went into her, and she conceived by him. Then she arose and went away, and taking off her veil, she put on the garments of her widowhood. When Judah sent the young goat by his friend, the Adullamite, to take back the pledge from the woman's hand, he did not find her. And he asked the men of the place, where is the cult prostitute who is at Enaim at the roadside? They said, no cult prostitute has been here. So he returned to Judah and said, I have not found her. Also, the men of the place said, no cult prostitute has been here. And Judah replied, let her keep the things as her own, or we shall be laughed at. You see, I sent this young goat, and you did not find her. About 3 months later, Judah was told, Tamar, your daughter-in-law, has been immoral. Moreover, she is pregnant by immorality. And Judah said, bring her out and let her be burned. As she was being brought out, she sent word to her father-in-law, by the man to whom these belong, I am pregnant. And she said, please identify whose these are, the signet and the cord and the staff. Then Judah identified them and said, she is more righteous than I, since I did not give her to my son Shelah, and he did not know her again. When the time of her labor came, there were twins in her womb. And when she was in labor, one put out a hand, and the midwife took and tied a scarlet thread on his hand. This one came out first. But as he drew back his hand, behold, his brother came out. And she said, What breach you have made for yourself. Therefore his name is called Perez. And afterward his brother came out with a scarlet thread on his hand, and his name was Zerah. What a story. By the way, we don't often cover that story in the children's class in there. But one of the things that is unusual when you look at the account of the genealogy of Jesus is that we see that unlike many of the other genealogies, women are included in it. And so we have that Tamar, and can anybody name the women that are in Jesus' genealogy that are given? We have Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, and in between there, we go back to Solomon's mother. So it's a rather, in some terms, rather scandalous, the names that are included in here. When you look at Tamar, and who was Perez's dad? Why, he's his own grandpa, as the song talks about. And so none of this has been cleaned up for us as we look at the genealogy. And the purpose is that God has used whatever means to provide and perpetuate that Messiah who is going to come. And as you follow that genealogy, whether you are in the book of Matthew, which only goes back to Abraham, or you go to Luke, which goes all the way back to Adam, we see that God kept many people alive by various means. And so let's just get started in verse 40. But sometime after this, remember that's when he had been sold by those traders down in Egypt. Sometime after this, the cupbearer of the king of Egypt and his baker committed an offense against their lord, the king of Egypt. And Pharaoh was angry with his... I've skipped an entire chapter. Yes, I did. How come someone didn't raise their hand? Now Joseph had been brought down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, and the captain of the guard, an Egyptian, had bought him from the Ishmaelites, who had brought him down there. The Lord was with Joseph, and he became a successful man, and he was in the house of his Egyptian master. His master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord caused all that he did to succeed in his hands. So Joseph found favor in his sight and attended him, and he made him overseer of his house and put him in charge of all that he had. From the time that he had made him overseer in his house and over all that he had, the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. The blessing of the Lord was on all that he had in house and field. So he left all that he had in Joseph's charge. Because of him, he had no concern about anything but the food that he ate. So here we read not only in verses 2 and 3, but then we drop down to verses 5 that God has blessed Joseph in all that he has done. And we'll say, why did God bless Joseph? Connect the dots here. He's showing the integrity of Joseph. And as we come down to the end of verse 6, and it says, Now Joseph was handsome in the form and appearance, and after a time his master's wife cast her eyes on Joseph and said, Lie with me. But he refused and said to his master's wife, Behold, because of me my master has no concern about anything in the house, and he has put everything that he has in my charge. He is not greater in his house than I am, nor has he kept back anything from me except you, because you are his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? And as she spoke to Joseph day after day, he would not listen to her, to lie beside her, or to be with her. So we're seeing the integrity and the uprightness of Joseph through all of this. And God continues to bless him. And you think, well, then everything is going to turn out well, and they're going to live happily ever after. Isn't that how fairy tales that we typically read? Everything's going to work out. Nothing's ever going to go wrong for him. but God has other plans to this, plans of which it's going to be hard for him to connect the dots. But in all of this, Joseph is still going to come to that conclusion that all of this happened that he might bring people back alive through all of this great famine that's about to happen. So we'll stop right there since we've heard the second buzzer. I am not going to hold you back from the food any longer than I absolutely have to. And I hope that if you can, that you'll stay for our potluck, which is coming up shortly. Any questions? I'm sorry I didn't open it up. No, they would not have believed, but they would have believed in many gods. So they would have recognized that whoever was with Joseph was blessing him over and over. And it's not always clear to see that. He may have attributed it to one circumstance or another, but he attributed it to the providence of God who was with him and blessing him.